Passing arguments to functions in Go can be pretty tedious, especially if you have situations like this. So here I have an LLM and I basically want to get an answer to a question. And as you can see, my LLM generate function accepts these parameters. Let's say history, temperature, model, temperature being a float, model being like GPT 5.2, let's say. And if I want to call it multiple times, it's pretty tedious to have to pass the temperature and the model all the time. But it's actually a simplified example because LLMs can accept more parameters usually. For example, you might be able to pass parameters of an MCP server, let's say, and there you'd have to pass a URL, a name of the server, and so on. So long story short, you might have many parameters. Not all of them are really mandatory for the caller, but your function still has to kind of expect them. And there's an easy fix in Go to this, and there are no built-in default values for parameters, unfortunately, so you have to use some tricks. Now let's take a look how we can fix the situation. So first of all, what I do when I have such functions is I try to define what parameters are really mandatory for any use case. And for any use case, when you call an LLM, you need a context and you need a history. Even if it's a single message, you can still kind of generalize it and call it history. So you need a context to be able to abort, for example, if it takes longer, and you need a history. But temperature, for example, or model, you wouldn't necessarily send it or you wouldn't necessarily specify it all the time when you call this generate function, or you wouldn't want to. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these two parameters and I'm going to create a new type called generate, which is the name of this function, a config. And it's going to be a struct. And here I'm going to define temperature and model. But I am not going to pass this config type as an argument to this function. Instead, I'm going to define a new type called option. And here I'm going to define a function which accepts this generate config as a parameter. And after that, what I'm going to do is actually pass options like this. And now, as you can see, if we go to main, these values are no longer expected here. So I'm going to get rid of them. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to define a few more functions. So first of all, with temperature, and second of all, with model. Now, as you can see, what we do here is actually the following. So how do we actually call this function? Let's first take a look at how we call these functions. I can call these functions like this, and I can pass these parameters or whatever I want to specify here. For example, 0.5 with model GPT 5.2, or I can pass anything else. And so let's say here I'm going to pass just 0, and here I'm going to pass 4.1. So instead of passing these values into the function directly, I'm passing kind of calls to these functions with the values that I want to provide. For example, 0.0 for temperature and GPT 4.1 for model. And now this is what our interface looks like, and the only thing we need to do now is change the implementation a little bit. So here I'm also going to accept options. And now the implementation is going to become a little bit different. So first of all, I need to define the config itself. I'm going to do it like this. Config is a pointer to config, or I actually like to do it like this. And then I'm going to iterate over all the options that are passed to this function. And I'm going to, as you remember, this option, I like to call it opt. This option is actually a function that modifies this configuration. And now I'm going to change this code to actually access this config instead of trying to access the values directly. And now if we run the code again, as you can see, it uses the provided values that I specified here in the caller. And the advantage of this approach is that instead of having to define all the values that we had previously every single time when you call this function, like temperature or model, you can also delete all of them, and this function can still be called. Now the problem is that these values are empty, so we just allocate space for them, but we don't set any values actually. And what I like to do in this case is func new generate, or new OpenAI, because it's implementation specific, new OpenAI generate config, and then this returns a config. And here I like to define default values for that. So let's say 5.2 is our default model and 0.7 is our default temperature. And now instead of defining the config like this, I'm going to do it like this. And now if I run it again, as you can see, our temperature is 0.7 and our model is 5.2. And we didn't specify anything here. And here I can say with temperature, for example, and I can say 0.0. And now the model is going to be 5.2, but the temperature is going to be 0. Or I can also specify the model separately. Let's say GPT 4.1, and now the temperature is going to be 0.7 and the model is going to be 4.1. Again, this whole situation where we passed the temperature and the model all the time might not look so painful, but imagine you have lots of these calls, and imagine you have more parameters, which is really common when you when you interface with LLMs. For example, as I mentioned, you might have an MCP server that you would like to call, and in this case you need to provide a URL, for example, to this MCP server. It would be something like this, and then all the other things that are required for an MCP server to work. So it becomes just more painful if you have more parameters, and it becomes more painful if you have more calls to this function. Thanks for watching.